Okay, now we are.
Yep.
All right.
Hello, everybody. I'm here again with Oliver Heydorn. My name's William Waite, and we're on episode 11 of the Douglas Social Credit Podcast. Um, I just uh, I just suggested this to Oliver now, so he's unprepared for this. But I suggested that we talk about Oliver's a long-standing Catholic, and we talk about just issues surrounding the church, his views on scandals that have occurred in the last however long. Seems like a long time, but I'm not sure when it actually started. And just his experience of the church and perhaps some personal thoughts on religion generally and where it is in the world today. I know that's going to be a long podcast if we get to get to all that, but so Oliver, if you'd like to perhaps begin by um, perhaps describing your early years in the church. You said you've been a Catholic all your life and your parents have been Catholic.
Yeah, so I was baptized as an infant and went to Catholic school. Did the first communion, first confession, confirmation, the whole bit. I've always gone to church on Sundays. I've had a prayer life, frequented the sacraments, and so forth. And of course, I grew up after Vatican II, so the
What was
church.
the last one? Sorry, the sacraments. Yeah.
I grew up after Vatican II, so the church had already undergone its own sort of internal revolution um, during the 60s. Although that didn't happen so much at the Vatican Council itself, it was sort of more what happened afterwards. So it was a case basically of giving people an inch, and then some people end up taking a mile, and the church has been more or less in crisis ever since. So one of the things that I would specify is that I feel, even though I was, you know, brought up a Catholic, baptized as an infant, as I said, I don't think that the church has ever fully been herself in my whole lifetime. So
So this is as a result of Vatican II.
as a result
Can you
of,
describe what you mean by like the revolution that occurred at Vatican II?
yeah, so there were various changes, primarily changes to the liturgy, which occurred not at Vatican II itself, but it was something that arose afterwards. If you read, for example, the Sacred Constitution on the Liturgy, the changes that were being recommended to the Mass and to the other sacraments, these were very small changes. You know, Latin was to be preserved as the language of the Mass in the Roman Rite. Gregorian chant was to have pride of place, and whatever changes were contemplated were supposed to be minor, more or less organic. But the mass that we ended up getting, uh, let's say 1969, 1970, was a completely uh, sort of a mass that was created by committee. So it didn't follow the intentions of what the council fathers had foreseen. And so instead of it being sort of like a codification or a maybe a pruning of the existing mass that went back several centuries, it was an entirely new product, and there were Protestant observers and others who had input into, what this new mass is going to be like.
Okay.
And as a result of this, people took this as a green light that, oh, we're sort of jettisoning everything and throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's a new world, and we're going to do
Mm.
things completely different. And so there's been a breakdown in the transmission of basic doctrine. There's been a breakdown in liturgy, a breakdown in discipline, and it now seems under Francis that all of this is reaching its natural conclusion, which might be very terrifying. Um,
So, being what sort of a complete unmooring of like normal Catholic procedures and ways of worship and things, or
yeah, it's very clear to any Catholic that the faith is something that in its essence is transmitted from generation to generation. It's just you just can't say, okay, we're going to re-engineer it now, and or we're going to break substantially with the past. It doesn't work that way. It's never worked that way. Um, and I have this theory that I have tried to get my co-religionists to see and to understand and to discuss, but it's like talking to a wall. The church has a very well-defined teaching on usury, which goes back many centuries. It's not exclusively a Christian teaching. You can find it in the pagan philosophers, the Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, etc., which is that there is no intrinsic justification for the charging of interest on a loan. Right? That you can find that in the encyclical Vix Prevenit, which was Benedict the 14th, I believe, in the 1700s. Now, that encyclical does say that there can be extrinsic justifications for receiving more money in payment for what you lend. So, for example, if you're lending money to someone and there's genuine risk, or you're giving up an investment opportunity, or it's costing you something to lend, then within reason and proportionately, you should be compensated.
mm,
And so, a bank obviously can't operate without charging its customers for its services because then the lenders would be taking advantage of the bank, right? Now,
mm,
we're very far from that, of course. When you look, for example, in Canada, with the four or five big banks, they're making billions and billions of dollars in profit. It's much higher
yes,
than the profits they would be making if the banking industry in this country were perfectly competitive, right?
mm.
So we're talking about oligopoly profits. And so certainly there's usury going on there, and it's institutionalized. The point that I wanted to make, though, in reference to the church is because the institutional church has not succeeded in promulgating this teaching and enforcing it insofar as it could enforce it, what has happened over the centuries is that the bankers and the central bankers in particular have become so wealthy and so powerful, so influential that they are now in a position where they can buy everything and everyone that can be bought. And the name of the game, the policy that they've adopted is monopoly. They want to monopolize everything, control everything. So naturally, that includes the institutional church. So we have a situation where because churchmen, the institutional church, has failed to clearly promulgate its teaching on usury and finance and things like this, that over the centuries, the usurers have become so rich and powerful that they're now in a position to usurp, infiltrate, take over the institutional church. And I think Vatican II was part of that. And now, of course, they're wanting to,
So, are you saying that before, like when was the 1960s, the
yeah.
church was true to its doctrine of no usury? Like that's what it was saying.
I think that teaching was far more acceptable, or far more. It was something that more Catholics would have had some knowledge of. It was still not something that, in many cases, there are exceptions like Father Coughlin in Michigan. Um, it's still not something that they were making a big deal over, and not completely without reason, because the financial system had become so integrated with so many facets of life that it becomes very difficult to uh, sort of discern, okay, is this usury? Is this not usury? What happens when you have people that have money in bank accounts and are receiving interest? You see?
Mm,
Um, I would argue that probably those people, I mean, we all have had money in the bank at some point and we've been paid interest on it. But I would say what we get back from the banks is probably uh, a pittance in comparison with the amount of money we have turned over to banks and the payment of interest on loans throughout our lifetimes and also through our taxes, through the interest that's paid on public loans. Uh, so it got I think it's finance became so pervasive and um so much a part of every aspect of life in the modern world that it became very difficult to say exactly, well, how do you, apart from having a complete re-engineering of the system from the bottom up, how do you discern what is usury, what is not usury? How do we enforce this at this point without calling for the complete um, renovation of the system? Now, Douglas social credit, of course, is beautiful because had that been understood and had it been talked about and had it been promoted by church authorities in whatever sort of sub rosa way they wanted to do it, the adoption of the Douglas social credit monetary proposals, which go far beyond this question of usury, would
Mm.
have solved the problem of usury by filling the gap with debt-free credit, compensatory consumer dividends, and consumer discounts. And so a lot of the usury then would have been taken out of the system automatically.
Mm. Well, at the moment, I mean, the banks have basically become a cost center, haven't they?
Mm,
And usury is a big part of that. I mean, I was reading the other day, Douglas wrote a list of 5 things that contributed to the gap,
hmm.
and one of them was interest payments because it was costs on intangibles, I think he called it,
Yep.
or payments on intangibles. It doesn't actually contribute anything of itself to the value of the product.
Hmm.
It's sort of this auxiliary system that feeds costs into it. So I mean, I suppose in a very serious way, the getting back to the church, the role of the church is to deal with the big issues, though, isn't it?
Sure.
I mean, um, you think it's a failure that they didn't intervene when they should have on this thing of on usury, and what could have they done?
Well, I mean,
I mean,
it's,
the
it's
church is
much
powerful and
easier.
wealthy, of course.
Sure. It's much easier to have dealt with this problem centuries and centuries and centuries ago. And so you end up with situations, I'm sure, where the church was in need of funds, so they took out loans, so they ended up being under the power of the bankers themselves. And so in order,
Mm.
in many cases, I'm sure churchmen were in difficult situations where, oh, well, we can't speak out against usury because we are indebted to such and such a banker for, rebuilding a church or constructing a church or what have you. And and so I mean they're not immune to those sorts of compromising situations. And so they
Mm.
eventually over time it's like we just have to live with this because it's too big a problem um to address, I suppose. But of course, as I say, had Douglas social credit been better understood and discussed and adopted, I think we would have had a weapon made for the hour
An
that could.
alternative.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm.
That's right.
Um, I wanted to ask you about the. So, do you is it reversible? You see from this point, could the church do something now
I
that it's
think
gone this far?
I always think that the church can do something. I mean, we do hold that at rock bottom, it's a supernatural institution. I mean, it's filled with human beings, and sometimes the people in positions of power in offices of the church are not the best people. It operates
Mm.
like any other human institution in that regard. But certainly, I think there's nothing to say that even at this hour, that if certain individuals in the hierarchy would put two and two together and get their act together, that they actually could have a significant influence on the not just the conscience and consciousness of Catholics, but of the whole entire
mm,
world. There is this theory, and I think even non-Catholics can appreciate this, that one of the things that has helped to keep humanity on the straight and narrow is the moral authority of the church. And as that has weakened after Vatican II, and especially now under Francis, the barriers are starting to it's like being in Holland, that the church was kind of like the dike keeping the waters out. And should the
mm,
church fail, we're going to be flooded. Right. So even people that might have issues with this church teaching or with the way the church has managed this, that, or the other, I think they can recognize that whatever its faults, the church has served as a moral authority, has provided uh, certain guidelines. I mean, when Pope John Paul II used to speak out authoritatively, strongly against abortion, people would take notice.
mm,
Like it was like, okay, we're being put on notice here, by the Vicar of Christ. Now, with Francis, it's hard to take, is the Pope Catholic? It's hard to take him seriously.
mm,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
and I'm not in possession of any documents or whatever, but we do know that there has been infiltration into the church, and the people ultimately behind that would be the money power, it'd be the international money power, the usual suspects. So
mm,
um, they infiltrate and control all institutions in order to devise this kind of, the church, as I said, the church was a barrier, so they have to dismantle it. They have to get rid of it. They have to take
yes,
it over. Um, and I think that's what's happening now. And yet you've got a lot of Catholics who are, in crisis mode, who are in free fall, who can't understand what's happening. And, some people are losing their faith and some people they're not going to church anymore and all this sort of stuff. And you say to them, it's finance, it's international finance that's behind this. And it's because we have a Catholic social teaching that's not being promulgated, not being applied. And this is the natural consequence. And as I say, it's like you're talking to a wall. It's just it doesn't register. I don't know. They don't understand it, or it's like I'm speaking Chinese. But this
mm,
this is Saint Paul in, I think it's Thessalonians. He talks about the mystery of iniquity that's working itself out through the centuries. And I believe that on a human level, on a natural level, a good part of the mystery of iniquity is in fact this monster of finance, of oligarchic finance, of dishonest finance, of dysfunctional finance. We live
mm.
under an anti-Christian financial system. And is it any wonder then that an anti-Christ, an anti-church should arise as a result of the outworkings of this anti-Christian financial system? You think it would be obvious, but they don't see it.
They don't want to see it, probably.
Perhaps they don't want to see it, or I don't know what it is. I mean, apart
Mm,
from this question, though, even Douglas said in his day, anytime you wanted to say, okay, why do we have all these social problems, these political problems, these uh, international problems? And he'd say it's the financial system because of the way it malfunctions. There's this technical problem with it. It doesn't give us enough income to offset the costs and prices it's simultaneously generating. And we need monetary reform. He would say, I'd explain that to people, and people would not accept it. Like they would point to anything else before accepting that as the diagnosis.
mm,
We're having problems because there are too many sunspots. We're having we're
mm,
having problems because of human nature. It's sinful human nature. We don't pray enough. We don't go to church enough. Or we're having problems because there's a class division between the capitalists and the proletarians, or because I mean, you can come up with so many reasons. Because the cultural Marxists say it's because the oppressors are oppressing the oppressed, and of course, this is the case with men versus women, and whites versus non-whites, and cisgender versus transgender, and so on. It just the same pattern is being
mm.
repeated over. This is the problem with society. It's just no, we're all being oppressed by the financial system. That's the core issue.
Yes.
And if
Yes.
we fix the system so we're not being oppressed by it, all these fake divisions and oppositions
So
generated, they go by the wayside because that's not the problem, right? It's the
yeah,
artificial financial pressure to which we are all subject, and the distortions that arise in the economy, the policy that's being imposed on us that is making people unwell.
yes. Yeah, that's very well put. That's excellently put. So, just to be clear, the doctrine on the church is, oh, sorry, the doctrine on usury is still fully in place.
Yeah, I mean, it
Like
can.
they could come out. It's just, is it just something like that they don't talk about?
They don't talk about it generally. It's not talked about. I mean, you might find a reference here or a reference there, but it's something that your average Catholic probably wouldn't know anything about it. Your average Catholic, unfortunately, today probably doesn't even know what usury is, you know.
So they're just ignoring
Yeah, it's not talked about. It's not, you would never hear a sermon on it, probably. Certainly not in the Novus Ordo. You might potentially hear something if you went to a traditional Latin mass. But even the traditionalists, this is not something that they talk much about. I think some of the reticence may be that might be due to the fact that they don't want to talk about things that they're not experts in because they might be made to look foolish or whatever. But having said that, they don't have to go into any great detail. They just have to stick with what was formulated in Vix Prevenit in the encyclical from 1745 or something. And that makes it very clear that there's no intrinsic claim, no intrinsic justification, no intrinsic title to being paid back more than you've lent. And if you are paid back more than you lent, it's got to be proportionate to extrinsic justifications. Like, for example, if the inflation rate is 2%, then you should, at the end of a year, you should get back the money you lent plus 2% to cover inflation. That makes sense, right? So if you charge
it.
2%, to cover inflation's a lot more now than 2%, but just as an example, there should be some proportionality there. There's this is a bit personal, I suppose, but uh, many years ago, my mother lent my grandfather $2,000. This is like in 1970 something because he was a bit short on funds, and uh, they came from a family of eight, so there were younger siblings who weren't working and so on and so forth. So he needed some extra money. She lent him the money. He didn't repay her for many, many decades. And eventually she brought it up and said, remember that $2,000, you never paid me back. And this is toward the end of his life, right? So he did pay her back, but he paid her back $2,000 like 30 years after the fact. And my mother was very happy about this. And I said, well, you do realize that the $2,000 you lent in 1970, whatever it was, yeah, is was probably, $10,000 worth, and he should have paid you $10,000 worth, not 2,000. But you can't worry about all these things. So, so, so had she said,
Yeah.
"You need to pay me back," in proportion to the inflation that's ensued in the intervening years, she would have been perfectly within her rights. So,
I was going to ask you what your read on these various scandals that have rocked the church in recent times.
mhm.
What do you think about them? I mean, there is some truth to them, obviously, and you've sort of dealt with that. You said it's subject to the same human limitations all institutions are, but
I think, well, I'd say, like, to start off with, as I understand the statistics, a Catholic priest is no more likely to abuse than many other sectors of society. And they say that some sectors, like teachers, for example, actually have a higher abuse rate than the Catholic clergy. So yeah, there have been terrible cases that have happened, of course, but it's still like a small minority of priests that are doing this.
Hmm.
I just want to put that out there, like perspective. Um, that shouldn't be happening. I mean, there should be zero tolerance. And I think sometimes, for the sake of protecting the institution in the past, the church is like, well, how do we deal with this? Well, we'll just kind of
Hmm.
move them from parish to parish, or we'll will sweep it under the rug or what have you. Um, I do think at the same time that here again the international money power sees this. They control the media, so they're going to put the focus, the light on it, and exaggerate the severity and the frequency to the point where a lot of people, even very highly educated people, seem to think that every other priest is guilty of this, or that it's such a problem that most priests are doing it. It's like, no, that was never the case.
Mm,
You know, so
mm.
I think
Yeah, well, that is it.
it's very easy to lose perspective on these things when it's being drilled all the time by the media, which are
Yes.
not, they're not friendly to the church to begin with. But having said that, the church officials have oftentimes been their own worst enemies as well. So, it just becomes a bit of a mess after a while. Um, but I think the way to deal with it is zero. You just have to zero tolerance, just zero tolerance. I mean, at the same time, um, you don't want to create a situation where false accusations are being made and innocent priests are being put through the ringer. You don't want a witch hunt situation either.
No, sure.
So you've got to balance those two things. Um, and but certainly I think the interests of the people affected should come first ahead of the institution.
As in the victims, or
Oh yeah, the victims of abuse or potential, even those that could be, the children have to come first, and they should be
mm,
put ahead of the interests of the institution. I mean, that would
sure.
that would be a
Yeah,
very Christian thing to do. That would be a very social credit thing to do. That institutions exist to serve individuals. Individuals are not there to be sacrificed for the good or the preservation of an institution.
yes.
And that applies to the
Yeah.
church.
Did Douglas say something once that oh, what? How did he describe it? The something above all other is self-development. What was that quote?
Ah, yes, he says
Ecclesiastical, economic, political.
systems were made for men, and men were not made for systems. And the interest of man, which is self-development, is above all systems, whether they be theological, political, economic, etc. Right?
That's it.
So, which is a very Christian idea, really, right? That the
Mm,
the association institutions, they exist for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to serve the individuals who make them
the
up.
self-development of the individual.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm,
So, I mean, there are other aspects to this as well. Some people, and haven't looked into this that carefully, but some people maintain that a lot of these abuse cases, sure, there was abuse before the council, but a lot of it seemed to happen after the council, interestingly enough. And so
yeah,
it
okay.
seems to be fallout from the same revolution that occurred in the church. And I'm not saying either that everything prior to the council was perfect or that there wasn't need for reform or anything like that, but very often when there's need for reform, if you've got vested interests there that have their own agenda, they can push reforms that actually are not in the best interest of either the institution or individuals. And I think very largely that's sort of what happened after Vatican II.
I think it was E. Michael Jones who wrote that. I guess it was after Vatican II, but I'm not sure that the church allowed sort of Freudian psychology to come into a lot of the priests' training.
Mhm.
And of course, that has this kind of like, view of sexual behavior as something which ought never be suppressed. And, you've got to act, all this kind of like
Yeah.
hyper-sex doctrine.
Yeah.
That's kind of a Freudian thing, isn't it?
Yes.
So
Yes. So, and there
I
are,
suppose
yeah,
if you,
cases of whole congregations that sort of got involved, especially in places like the States. I mean, it would be different in other parts of the world. But you've got cases of whole congregations that got involved in some of that sort of stuff, and they ended up hemorrhaging and losing a lot of their members. So, you know, I just think that they should have a situation in place where, to the greatest extent possible, There are safeguards, and if some instances do arise, that they're dealt with appropriately and swiftly, without at the same time sort of putting the priests in a situation where they feel like they're walking on eggshells, because that's not fair to them. I mean, most of them haven't done this, right? The vast majority. Can you imagine being a Catholic priest wearing your collar, let's say in public, or a cassock? And some people who, they've been fed this media hype for so many years, people assuming that, oh, you must abuse kids, and when in fact the vast majority never did that.
Oh,
Yeah,
of course, of course.
yeah,
Mm. And there were many, well, I don't know about many, but there were at least some who were accused of doing it, and it kind of wrecked them,
yeah.
and they never did it. I mean, Cardinal Pell, he was one of these.
A case in point,
Mm.
that he wasn't guilty of what they accused him of. I mean, it was so ridiculous because they were saying that the abuse occurred in the sacristy after Sunday Mass. Well, anybody that knows anything about how busy sacristies are after Sunday Mass would know that it couldn't possibly have happened, because people would have been coming and going all the time, and that would be the last place. If that was your intent, was to abuse someone, that would be that would be doing
Mm.
it like on the steps of the church itself. I mean, it's absurd on the face of it, you know.
Well, I remember the ABC just reported on it incessantly,
Mm.
and then when he was found not guilty of it, they basically just dropped it.
Hmm.
I heard one thing on the breakfast show, morning breakfast show, about it, him being found not guilty, and then never
Yeah,
heard of it again.
yeah, which is rather unfortunate because he was imprisoned for a while and he was never compensated. I don't think they ever apologized. I mean, it's a horrible thing to happen to someone who, whatever his faults, he wasn't guilty of what they accused him of. I mean, it was obviously trumped up.
Mm.
And so, yeah, it's I mean, he was very gracious about it. I mean, I wouldn't have been so it's tolerant, or he was very sort of stoic and accepting of it, especially at his advanced age. So yeah, things like that happen, and interestingly enough, to tie it in with other things we've been discussing, he had been tasked, I think, by Francis to investigate the Vatican Bank, and to because there were allegations of corruption and wrongdoing there, so he that was his sort of jurisdiction. And you do wonder whether this whole thing was brought up in order to neutralize him. The money power
Mm.
wanted him to back off, so this will make this a big deal and will punish him, and then people will think twice about investigating the Vatican Bank, right? So,
Mm.
um,
You would.
yeah, and there's also I can't substantiate this, but I was told by a Swiss banker that in the case of Benedict the 16th as well, that financial pressure had been brought to bear in order to force him to resign. That the Vatican was basically told that if you don't, this is a bit hearsay, but nothing would surprise me, that if you don't resign, because he was rather conservative traditionalist, if you don't resign, we're going to shut down the SWIFT code, and so you won't be able to make any international transactions. And so that was part of the pressure that was brought to bear in order to impose a policy on the church. So why does the church not talk about it? Well, potentially, if somebody's holding a gun to your head, you may not talk about it. I mean, this is
Sure.
not to excuse it, of course, because there's nothing to stop your average priest in a parish from talking about it. As far as I know, it's not that any directive has been sent out, never talk about this issue. So yeah, but I think that in a nutshell is what's happening. And until this is addressed and is given the attention that it deserves, I think things will just go from bad to worse. And I don't know why people are so hypnotized, why it seems to be so impossible to get through to them, because you would think all of this would be elementary and fundamental, basic stuff. And as it should be as clear as a bell to anybody who knows basic social doctrine, but for whatever reason, it's not. So
Let's pray that soon it will be.
yes, yes, we'll have to pray for divine intervention because clearly people aren't putting too much into it. So
We're nearly out of time, Oliver, but that was very interesting, and it's given me a lot to think about, and I hope the audience as well. We have websites, thepeoplescredit.com.au, and Oliver's is socred.org. We can be contacted there, and there's plenty of resources there. So have a look at those, and thanks for watching.
thank you.